for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. Indy, you mentioned something in your opening statement that I was very glad to hear because you rarely hear it either on Capitol Hill or just in the media as part of this discourse, and that is the great missing tax revenue. 2001, George W. Bush tax cuts, which weren't paid for. 2003, George W. Bush tax cuts, which also weren't paid for. Their extension, which was done on a bipartisan basis about a decade later. And then, of course, the 2017 Trump tax cuts. All told, are you able to put a number on just exactly how much missing tax revenue there is? Of course, as you pointed out, as you know, you think about that, it's too often around here, we hear about the spending side, but we don't hear about the whole other half of the equation, which is the revenue side. Want to make sure that if we're going to really talk about deficit and debt, we talk about both sides of the ledger.
That's right. Thank you, Ranking Member Boyle. We have, in many ways, as I mentioned, propelled ourselves into our current ratio of debt to our economic activity because of these tax cuts. Just to put it in perspective, in a decade or so, we would actually have seen that ratio decline were it not for these tax cuts and their extensions. So
the debt to GDP
the debt to GDP ratio would actually decline. The tax cuts on their own have added about $10 trillion to the debt since 2001, which is, I think, what you're getting at.
Yeah.
And I'll just emphasize quickly that in the United States, the overall tax, the taxes paid as a share of our economy and our economic activity is much closer to middle income countries and like Mexico even than it is to our wealthy peers who have higher living standards than the lower tax countries. So I think what we ultimately all want is higher living standards for the American people. And if anything, our low taxes are getting in the way of that here. We're not trying to reduce people's ability to have those high living standards. We want to reduce the cost of living that they face. And
this is before we even look at the disproportionate impact of those tax cuts in terms of where most of that money was going. I mean, the most recent round of tax cuts, the one for which I was here, the Trump tax cuts, officially called the TCJA, CBO estimated 83% of that going to the top 1% by the end of the 10-year window. Let me transition real quickly, though, to the debt ceiling, because this is something I've worked on for a long time. And while I think many people are now coming to understand the devastating consequences of default, I think there is a part of the conversation, though, that has been missed, and that is while the question of whether we default or not is binary, that obscures there's a whole continuum between then and now in which we could also suffer consequences, even if we ultimately raise the debt ceiling by the deadline. So I was wondering if you could talk about what happened in 2011. We did suffer the first ever credit downgrade in American history. One of the three credit agencies downgraded us, which according to the Government Accountability Office cost us over $1 billion in extra borrowing costs. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
That's right, and I'll just add that households suffer. Their household wealth fell by almost $2.5 trillion over the second and third quarter of 2011 as a result. Consumer confidence fell, mortgage spreads increased, and it led to hundreds of dollars a month in increased borrowing costs for new borrowers. So approaching the debt ceiling just makes it harder for Treasury to issue regular debt, and that creates a lot of uncertainty and increased costs throughout financial markets as well.
I would also just share in the 30 seconds I have left, based on conversations I've had, I feel quite confident that unfortunately the other credit agencies will downgrade us if this debt ceiling drama plays out much longer. And that, of course, has so many impacts. You just described what happened in 2011 in terms of household wealth. I fear this time it would, in fact, be worse. It's all the more reason that we solve this now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.